fall on the other side. Then it just ends walking through the streets of a very, very muddy York. So, it's an odd document. There are at least 4 ways to have conversations with these extracts. First, there are issues of authenticity. Is it true? Is it real? Tiger Dunlop was an author of both fiction and nonfiction, reminiscence. It's not in his handwriting, but there is no explanation for how it has ended up in his papers. We never know who the lady is. Her handwriting looks gorgeous. It's almost impossible to read. There are several words. We can't even tell her husband's name. We know it's something like Charles Manuel or Mansell or Morel. At some point I thought it could be an L, but I think it's an M. And this name does not appear in any army lists, in any subaltern rank, even though she goes to the trouble to tell us that he was an officer in the commissary. There is a Charles Manuel in Dumerol's regiment of foreign troops, but the records of service of that regiment do not match the elements of this story. It's not surprising, perhaps, that she does use a pseudonym for her husband, except there are a lot of real names dropped. Not only people like Francis de Rotenberg, the administrative commander of the forces in Upper Canada for a time, who she thought looked like, quote-unquote, an old Indian chief, when he politely opened a window for her in a Kingston church one Sunday. But also ordinary men, such as a Rainsford, a Moore, a Leonard, all traceable to surnames in the 104th Regiment of Foot. Others that she mentions are traceable to the 8th Regiment of Foot, and so on. And there are real events described. It seems almost without question that the evening the lady writer got abandoned on the quay, that the series of events she is describing are the early movements toward the Battle of Sackett's Harbor of May 29, 1813. She even mentions the USS Lady of the Lakes, the United States ship of war, Lady of the Lakes. She mentions a naval depot that this little mission her husband was on was targeted. She describes his small boat, which she calls the Woodpecker, and I can't find out if a woodpecker existed, but we know at least 6 small boats accompanied the British ships of war on the attack on Sackett's Harbor. And these issues of authenticity I'm going to pursue further. I've kind of been absorbed with that for about 2 or 3 weeks. I didn't know army lists existed, right, before I started doing this. I didn't know I'd be talking about battles and needing to figure this out. So there are issues of authenticity that I think are interesting. I'm not sure how much I care if this is a real document or not, but I've been finding the research fascinating. There is also the possibility to converse with the document about quote-unquote Indians. For in it, we have a newly arrived young English gentlewoman and officer's wife with fully formed articulations about Indian brutality, Indian savagery, Indian primitivism, Indian hostility. There is the possibility to converse with the document about the ways in which men and women alike defined and redefined the nature of household, and domestic space in war and in transition. But most pronounced, I think, is the discourse on respectability contained in this document, almost regardless of whether it's fact or fiction or somewhere in between. This passage, for example, is typical, and I'm going to read quite a long extract. Do I have time? Okay, I think that'll work. I now was left alone with, this is after the common soldier with the Irish brogue takes her to the cottage filled with ladies, okay? I now was left alone with poor Lily in my arms, now wide awake and looking round her in great confusion. We were alone, but it was my misfortune to hear a dialogue which was passing in the next room, which very much concerned me. The fair widow was referring to the propriety and practicability of my admittance into the house to another lady who very decidedly opposed it. A most extraordinary circumstance, Mrs. Fulton. A woman coming to the door at this hour in the company with a common private soldier? I am surprised you should hesitate. You may be certain she is a person of questionable, perhaps infamous character. For my part, having my daughters in the house, if you leave it to me, I must say at once, by no means admit her or any other strangers. I had still great confidence in my own appearance and manners, which would at once show to any woman of the world that I was above suspicion. And with a little time, I calculated upon ingratiating myself with the party so that they would by no means wish for my departure. Mrs. Fulton, looking with some compassion upon my wet and comfortless condition, showed me into a little dressing room where I found water and all needful things for a toilette. And having taken a change of clothes from my traveling bag, I took some pains to make the best of myself. No, not of myself, indeed, but of Charles Emms's wife and Lily's mother. You understand the distinction. I was very well satisfied with the result, which I had just arrived at when I was summoned to the tea table. There was a large party exclusively of ladies who all cast their gaze upon me as I entered. Late, and this is a little bit later after tea, I touched the keys of the piano, and as I expected, was asked to play for the company. I played several pieces and accompanied myself to a ballad, very much to the anticipation of my audience. Later still in the evening, in the course of the evening, I produced my portfolio of sketches, which were good. And finding that Miss H and her sister were studying Italian, I had a very good opportunity of showing my proficiency in that language. So that it must have been evident, as I could have wished, that the poor wanderer who owed her night's shelter to their compassion had not always been an outcast. And so on. And this is fascinating. Clearly, it is about commonly agreed upon markers of respectability. It's about the need for women without men, even among women, to market these markers of respectability. In a sense, the author embraced and accepted the parameters imposed to maintain and proclaim feminine respectability. In this case, for admittance to a place of public association among women. But clearly she also understood that even though respectability was a restrictive code, it nevertheless opened doors, even if they were sometimes, right, merely the doors to a problematic lady's house of refuge in a war-torn town. Such issues of self-presentation in public as autonomous beings was one of the ways which made the women's war of 1812 very, very different to the men's war of 1812. Thank you.
Yes, I found it.
Thank you very much, Julia. So, as you maybe can hear, there's collaboration going on. Maria knows the woodpecker. We may be at least able to solve part of this mystery. So I'm not sure, but that respectability piece, it seems to come full circle there. This is about authenticity as well, perhaps. It's hard to believe this woman was all that. So thanks very much for that. Our second speaker this morning is Maria Moncur, who's a PhD candidate at Queen's University. And she is not being supervised by Jane Arrington, however. Jane is a member of her PhD committee. Her supervisor is Jeff McNair. And so this is, I think, Maria's first time at Owen, so I want to welcome you among us. And Maria is presenting today a talk called Warriors and Widows, Women's Stories of the War of 1812. Maria.
Yes, I was sitting there during the previous talk going, yeah, I've heard that. I know that. I've seen that before. But yes, so we all know stories about women in the War of 1812. Heck, some of us have written copiously on the subject. We know about proud British or Canadian heroine Laura Secord, whose trek to Beaver Dams to warn Lieutenant Fitzgibbon of the impending American attack is now so legendary that when I tell a Canadian what I study, they ask, oh, you mean like Laura Secord? And her cow? We know about the intrepid Dolly Madison, who remained behind during the burning of Washington while the rest of her household fled in order to save the very first presidential portrait from the rising flames. The image of Dolly running determinedly through her burning house while her husband, President Madison, stood on a faraway hilltop watching the city burn has always really struck me as very, very satisfying. We may even know about lesser-known heroines. Many of them we've heard about this morning. Or, Molly Branch, Sophia Shaw, as questionable a heroine as Brock's purported fiancée might be. So we know stories about women. But these are indeed stories about women, told in many cases years later by men and women with agendas of their own. Often these stories tell more about the people writing them than they do about the people they're writing about. And while this raises other extremely interesting questions, which I will be dealing with in my dissertation, I'm here today to talk about women's stories of the War of 1812, not stories of women in the War of 1812. I want to tell you the stories that women wrote, dictated, contributed to, fabricated, lied about, or fervently believed. And during those first 10 years after the war, when the process of writing the war was still in its very earliest stages, when the stories of New Yorkers and Upper Canadians alike were not about national pride and honor, but were instead complaints about lost fences and stolen cattle. These are the stories created for government consumption, contained within the hundreds of handwritten petitions sent to the Upper Canadian Lieutenant Governor and to the United States Legislature between 1815 and 1825. And these are the tales owned by women, mediated though they may have been, and oftentimes were, by male scribes and male relatives, but these are still women's stories. So rather than tell you about Isaac Brock's purely fictitious fiancée, I would like to tell you about some other women. Oh yeah, I'll start that fight later. I'd like to tell you about some other women, and about how they viewed the War of 1812. And in so doing, I hope to show you that despite their relegation to the roles of weak widows and silent observers of the war in most War of 1812 stories, as Cecilia Morgan has discussed in the past, and as we've heard in other talks this morning, women on the frontier portrayed themselves as active and important participants in that war that either everyone or no one won. Now, women's petitions are particularly interesting in that, as Julia has just pointed out, we have very few records of women's responses to the war, especially poor and uneducated women. I remember when I first started studying history at the graduate level, and I asked my supervisor why all these women historians are looking at census data. Why don't they just read diaries? And he had to tell me that there weren't really that many. See, I had read Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's Midwife's Tale, which is, of course, but not everyone has a Martha Ballard to hand them a history of women. But petitions were a way that everyone, from the poorest to the richest, women, men, the Upper Canadian housewife, the governor of New York, everyone could have their say. And now, by 1815, the process of petitioning was already well established in both Upper Canada and New York, stemming from the same root in medieval Europe. At their base, petitions were a way for people to bring grievances before government and to express their approval or disapproval with policy and political practice. And in England, everyone had the right to petition. The petition had been brought to North America with European colonists and had remained a basic part of governance even under the new government of the United States, enshrined in the U.S. Constitution under the First Amendment right to free speech. So when the War of 1812 leveled the frontiers of Upper Canada and New York, and when the Commission specifically designed to handle the distribution of repayment and restitution failed to actually repay these losses, Upper Canadians and New Yorkers pulled out their pens and ink, or located their nearest literate relative, scribe, or lawyer, and I use literate very, very loosely, and wrote to the highest government authority that they had available. Now, women petitioners in particular were in a tricky position, of course, because gender conventions meant that the prescribed traditions of the petition form, which were quite formulaic and frankly a bit stodgy, were even more important when women stepped outside their prescribed roles as dependent, as wife, mother, or daughter, and addressed great men directly. The dangers of looking unfeminine were such that women had to filter their experiences through a variety of societal expectations before they even made it onto the paper. But the silence of women's voices in other War of 1812 texts is more than matched, with their presence in the pages of petition after petition, giving nod to social convention while firmly asserting their right to government recompense. For one, women as well as men signed group petitions, placing themselves as important and visible members of their communities. I found at least one, I found a lot of these, but in this particular case, I found at least one woman, Sophia Welsh of Niagara County, New York, who signed the petition sent by the people of that county to Congress in 1816, requesting assistance after the burning of Buffalo, Lewiston, and Black Rock, which followed the burning of Niagara. There was a lot of burning going on. But in so doing, she asserted herself as one of those who, quote, cheerfully contributed all in our power to aid and assist all military operations in our neighborhood, both offensive and defensive, and cheerfully bore a large share of the burdens necessarily attendant on a state of war. Sophia Welsh was a war participant, as much as any man in her district, in her support of the armed forces of the United States, she experienced deprivation and loss. And in a local war like the War of 1812, that placed her on the front lines of battle. For while men, and some women whose stories